China's fighting hard, and they're about to roll out, as you and I both know, their central bank digital currency. I think that's the greatest risk to the West and to the rules-based order that we have faced in the last multiple decades.
Hi, welcome to Stand Easy. Today I'm speaking with Mr. Kyle Bass, founder and chief investment officer at Hayman Capital Management. Mr. Bass is a founding member of the Committee on the Present Danger, China, and was the recipient of the 2019 Foreign Policy Association Medal for his responsible internationalism, and is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Bass has testified as an expert witness before the U.S. House of Representatives, U.S. Senate, and the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. Kyle has lectured on global economics at a number of universities to include Columbia, Harvard, Stanford, Berkeley, University of Chicago, and Virginia. With his exceptional background and experience, he was kind enough to share his time and his thoughts on the Chinese Communist Party and their strategy with regards to financial warfare. It was really a great pleasure to speak with him, and I hope this conversation helps expand the discussion on how warfare is evolving and the scale of the threat we face. I guess I'll open with, could you set the battlefield for us and what national security professionals need to understand about the Chinese Communist Party and financial warfare, and what are we missing in what's going on right now?
Yeah, so the most important thing for national security professionals to be thinking about is the architecture of the economic battlefield, and what I mean by that is exactly how the financial flows are structured, how they work, and how China uses them to their advantage, and also China's primary weaknesses, because they have a glaring weakness, and their propaganda efforts have convinced everyone that they don't have one, and it's very important to think about the four different battlefields that we have to be talking about. And typically national security professionals are thinking about one battlefield. To the extent that we're in a war with someone, it's always kinetic, or it's always been kinetic. First of all, the next war will be fought through the cyber and economic domains. I'm convinced of that. I'm convinced that we may not ever fire a shot in this next war. And the four wars I speak of is, right, number one's kinetic. And that's the one where we arguably have the best War Department in the world. The second domain is the cyber domain. And arguably we have, call it top two, cyber War Department in the world. We have some of the world's best. The other two domains are domains in which we really don't have War Departments. Number one is the economic War Department. China has one. They fight it every day. They have a grand strategy that we'll discuss a little bit in this discussion. We don't have one. Where we have the Commerce Department, we have the Treasury, we have the White House, we have the National Security Council, and we deal with economic advances or adversaries kind of as their fly balls being hit to us in a game. We kind of have to figure out which outfielder is going to go and run and chase it. And so it's very important to think about a whole of government approach, or actually just putting together a real team, a team of people that comprise the Economic War Department of the United States. That's something where we have a glaring hole in our defense, and that's one of them. The last domain is what I call the data/propaganda department, and the propaganda war. And we don't really have a propaganda department. We have a few government officials that use social media and use Twitter to get ideas out there, but they have entire buildings, and they have China has entire divisions of their PLA, their army, that's their cyber army, and they propagate in multiple languages all over the world their own propaganda and their own, call it narratives of all the situations that they want to propagate. And we don't have one of those departments either. My view from a national security perspective is we need to stand up an economic war department and a data/propaganda war department to make sure we're not losing either one of those wars. China's been fighting those wars with us since 2001. They've been fighting 3 out of 4, right? The propaganda data war, the economic war, and the cyber war. We are now fighting back on the cyber side. We've just started to push back on the economic side. And in this post-truth world, China's better at putting together narratives than we are. And we don't have an all of government approach to this. So when we talk about what national security people need to be thinking about, my view is setting up those two war departments.
And with that, could you describe the tactics or strategy they've been employing to use against us for, you say 20 years? What does that exactly look like?
Yeah. So again, what is deeply important to the Chinese government, to the CCP, and to the military is their access to dollars. When you think about, you look at SWIFT, you look at global cross-border currency settlement and international trade, about north of 80% of all trade settles in US dollars. All cross-border settlement happens in dollars, euros, yen, and pounds. And now there's a fraction that happens in the Chinese RMB, but it's about 1.8% of the globe. And if you peel back the layers of the onion of the 1.8%, the majority, 90% plus of that 1.8 happens in Hong Kong. It's China trading with itself, trying to raise its global legitimacy by saying its currency is starting to kind of take effect all over the world. No one in the world today accepts the RMB as legal tender. China's fighting hard, and they're about to roll out, as you and I both know, their central bank digital currency. I think that's the greatest risk to the West and to the rules-based order that we have faced in the last multiple decades. And we'll talk about that. But what they desperately need and what they have so adeptly built are pipes into China for dollars. They still have a closed capital account. They do not allow money out in any kind of free nature. They set very small limits for Chinese travelers to use dollars abroad. And then they attract dollars in and they don't let dollars out. And that's how they operate, not only economically, but that's where their military assertion comes from. They have to buy raw materials to build everything they're building for the military. They're short raw materials, they're short energy, they're short food, and all of those things they need dollars to buy them with. And what they're trying to do is change that in 2022. This is a tectonic shift, and it's something that we must really thoroughly understand from a national security perspective.
Now, I completely agree with everything that you've described as far as what China's done. Has the West, US, Canada, Europe, have we been, is this an own goal in many ways? We've allowed this to happen, and Western capital has continued to flow into China. How much of this is on us, and how do we rectify that? Sort of what's the defensive that we can do on our own?
Yeah, I think, I don't know, it's not really an own goal. I think that our presidential administrations, and again, this is completely nonpartisan. This is national security of our country, but the administration has to take leadership. I don't care which one it is and who's running our country, but whoever is the president and the president's cabinet needs to think about this national security problem as a whole of government issue and a whole of country issue. And what they've got to do is take the leadership position and basically either restrict or completely decouple. And I know that sounds hyperbolic, but we need to unpack that a bit. But if I've said publicly before, if the US national security is left up to Wall Street and the private sector, we will all be speaking Chinese tomorrow, right? This is greed and avarice over security. I think Wall Street has short-termism built into itself. They want to know how much money they're going to be paid at the end of the year in their bonus. And truly, that's all they care about. And that's how we've gotten to this situation where you called it an own goal. Again, if we continue to allow it to run in the manner in which it's running today, China knows how to dangle opportunity and greed and avarice in front of us, and we all go chase it. And so I think it's vitally important for the administration to set guidelines and set prohibitions and make things illegal. And what we've got to do is start enforcing our own rule of law. We're not doing so today.
Okay. Now, you alluded to setting up an economic warfare department. What would this look like? Who would staff it? Where would you get these people? And if you could just elaborate on that point.
Yeah, look, I would love to be king for a day. I could put together a formidable economic war department, because you need people that understand the architecture of financial systems. You need to have people that understand how macro and microeconomics work. And you need to have people that understand how those economics bridges to militarism, and economics and how it bridges to idealism, and how all of those things are propagated around the world. It's a grand strategy, and it doesn't have just an X and a Y axis, right? It has an X, a Y, and a Z axis. And the standing up of that department would need senior people. It's similar to the way CFIUS is set up today, right? The Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. You've got representatives from DOD, you've got representatives from the Treasury, you have representatives from Commerce, you have representatives from all of the various constituencies that have these expertise, these different expertises. It'd be just like putting together SOCOM, right? You need you basically, what you need a great person from the Army, Navy, the Air Force, Marines, and the Coast Guard. And then you need to integrate the best of all of our different verticals, and have proper dialogue, have a mission statement that talks about defense and offense, and have someone that's adept at understanding the grand strategy of our adversaries.
It's interesting you mentioned that it should be probably coming from the Department of Defense. I'm not saying that the other departments should come in, but it's almost like there's a lack of a champion right now. And interestingly enough, unrestricted warfare, now Major Generals Wang and Xiangsui, I'm not pronouncing that properly, but they're Liberation Army Air Force. And we've yet to see any of that literature come out, or strategy come out of the Department of Defense. And I'm just going to grab a quote and see where this leads into the renminbi, and where these gentlemen and the CCP are thinking. In one of his speeches in 2015, I quote, "We should promote the renminbi as a primary currency of Asia, just as the US dollar first became the currency of North America, and then the currency of the world. Every globalization was initiated by a rising empire. As a rising superpower, the One Belt, One Road initiative is the beginning of China's own globalization." Where does this go from now, and maybe expand on that quote, and where you see the renminbi, the central bank digital currency, and this problem proceeding in the coming years?
So it's vital to understand China's, again, major vulnerability today. Number one, we need to, if you read the DNI report that was released annually in the most recent one, 2021. If you read the DIUX report from 2016, 2017, when you think about DOD and DOD's intellectual elite, we've been calling China a, quote, strategic competitor, because that's politically correct. I think you and I both know China is not our friend. I would classify them as our enemy. They're fighting multiple wars against us. We know it. And yet our galaxy brain globalists want to think that the kumbaya is still going to work, and that we should hug all of our adversaries and figure out how we need to teach them capitalism, and that we're going to teach them a better system and they're going to adopt it. That we've already lost that bet. We made that bet in 2001, and it was a bad one. And we need to start classifying our enemies as enemies. And I think that when you talk about the mindset, I know I sound like I'm a McCarthyist, but it is vital to start calling the spade, calling our enemies, because I think that's how you get people to coalesce together to really start talking about strategy on how to defend against that enemy and how to use offense against that enemy. And we're doing so in the cyber domain. We're not doing so in the other domains. But your question about the RMB in particular is again vital to the national interest of China. It's vital to the call it geopolitical situation that China wants to attain, which is global supremacy. As you know, they've said so in multiple speeches by Xi and his predecessors. So global primacy maybe is really what they're after. But when we think about the RMB today, if we had a whole of government approach and we wanted to really stop them, not just tweet at them and say, oh, these gross human rights abuses need to be put into check, or we start to ban Uyghur or Xinjiang cotton or things like that. Those are half measures and maybe not even half measures. If we want to take real measures and we want to really cripple China for their bad actions, what we can do is simply take them off the dollar system, right? We can sanction their banks through Treasury's OFAC, and when we do that, that removes China's ability to move dollars around the world, and it literally cripples them. What they're trying to do with the digital RMB, the CBDC rollout of 2022, is take all of their trading and investment counterparts and force them to take dollars, euros, yen, and pounds, mostly dollars, to buy this new currency with, so they get trillions of additional reserves of real currency, and they're going to issue a digital currency for a multitude of reasons. But what that will do is it won't change the dollar's reserve currency status overnight, but it will take them from 0 to somewhere around 15% of the globe. And that's a tectonic shift. And that also lessens it dramatically lessens their dependence on the dollar, which will enable their belligerence in the South China Sea. It will enable them to go take Taiwan and not worry about our sanctions. I believe China's setting up to move away from the dollar and force everyone that trades and invests with them to accept this new CBDC, so that their militaristic belligerence can continue around the world. That's why I believe it's such a vital concept for all of our national security community to truly understand what's happening behind the scenes.
You've been an articulate and I think very honest opponent of our decision making with regards to how to handle the Chinese Communist Party and finances and their general strategy. What I'm wondering is, we're going through a reckoning with our best case scenario planning in the Middle East, and I'm wondering how much longer do rose-tinted glasses taint our view of the Chinese Communist Party, and what does the worst case look like for the months and years to come? How fast could this move?
Yeah, it's moving at warp speed as we speak, right? Because how many people in the national security community and the presidential administration, National Security Council, are really thinking about the digital RMB rollout as being the biggest threat that we've seen in the last 5 decades?
Okay.
Right. I mean, I don't hear anybody else talking that way.
Yeah.
I'm pulling up a picture. I know I said I wasn't going to do this, but there's a billboard that China just put up. Let me see if I can. So this is a billboard that's been put up all over Southeast Asia.
Wow.
The new world currency, the RMB, by the Bank of China. So they're doing this already. It's important. It's just important to note that what they're doing. You and I, if I were the Chinese, what I would say to the world, as I would say, look, we deserve our rightful place in the world. We're 15% of global GDP today. We should have 15% of global cross-border currency settlement, and you should allow this to happen. And my view of this is, it's not only a digital currency, it's the entire Chinese tech stack being loaded onto your computer, into your bank account, into your life, and it will know everything about you. The Chinese government will know how Michael St. Pierre spends his money, what his spending proclivities are, what maybe his vices are, what his weaknesses are. They will find a way to exploit you and me and anybody else once they're running this project you probably know called the Human Data Project, and they're collecting data on every single American and every single person in the West into a database. And they have our iris scans because we're using Zoom right now. They have your facial scan, they have mine, they have our irises, they're collecting data on all of us at all times. But this RMB, again, isn't just money. It enables China to export their digital authoritarianism. If you and I say something public and negative about the Chinese regime, they can actually affect our, call it, Chinese social credit score, and maybe even turn off some of our digital money. They can literally affect our bank account. And imagine if they had that kind of influence and that kind of reach into the West, into the US, Canada, Mexico, who you choose, wherever, Europe. Today, you and I both know they have that total control over their own population. They're looking to export that. And what I think is likely to happen is we're going to be thrust into a bipolar world. A lot of people like to call it multipolar, but I'd call it bipolar. I'd call it the US, Europe, and the West, and then the bad guys. And you're going to have China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, and the rest of the stans and the Middle East on one side. You're going to have the developed West on the other. And so I believe it's going to be, while it's multipolar, it's really bipolar with leadership. And that's what China wants at the moment. And therefore, the national security community needs to come to the conclusion that we can't allow the digital RMB to be legal in the United States, Canada, and Europe, i.e., I think it's a cancer. It's a digital cancer. And you can't just have a little bit of cancer. You either have cancer or you don't. And we need to come to that conclusion quickly. I'm fearful that China has its influence operations everywhere. You and I both know how much they've spent on university grants, how many university professors they've corrupted and co-opted, how many think tanks they've funded, how many white papers they've had think tanks write. I don't think we can mobilize our national security community fast enough to disallow or make illegal the digital RMB, which I think is vital to our national security interest.
Now, with the digital RMB, we've also seen Western capital become invested, and with I hate to use the word, bifurcation of the global order, what happens to domestic economies? What happens to the pension funds that have put their fingers into the pie? How does this play out domestically if we slow roll this, or it happens at pace as you suggest?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're probably familiar with CalPERS, the largest public pension fund in the United States. You know, somehow the Chinese government got a 1,000 Talents member to become the CIO of CalPERS. Now, since then, he's been fired for crossing their ethical boundaries. But for instance, CalPERS has $3 billion worth of Chinese securities that are on our blacklist at state and treasury. So when you think about how you say, what does that mean to our pensions? And how have they really embedded themselves here? Well, they've convinced the Henry Hernandez and MSCI that they should make the Global Emerging Markets Index over 40% China. And so I've heard the arguments now when I say, how can we be funding a regime that has been labeled a genocidal regime committing crimes against humanity? So from a human rights perspective, that should be a full stop. However, we get into, again, strategic competition and whether or not they're our enemy. And yet we have these pipelines built of US retirement savings and even military savings with the thrift savings plan. Now, hopefully we stop that. But we have these pipes built to constantly fund this kind of rogue government that's our enemy. And when I talk to people on the Hill, legislators or their aides, I'm starting to hear from them, well, we're so invested there that if we pull out or ban investment there, that it's going to be cutting off our nose to spite our face. We're going to be hurting ourselves because we have so much capital invested there. Of course, that's a terrible argument. But China has been very, very smart over the last 2 decades, and they have worked tirelessly to influence these pipes of passive capital flows so that I'll use maybe terrible analogies, but those pipes are the blood that keep the tumor growing. And so at some point in time, we need leadership from the top to say, we're no longer going to fund this government. The government needs to figure out how to fund itself. meaning the Chinese government. And today, you and I can buy a Chinese government bond. There are plenty of Chinese government bond funds. We can buy them directly. Why on earth would the U.S. administration allow the U.S. population, whether it's an individual institutional investor, to help fund a government that's actively building a military and actively fighting a number of wars against us? Why would we allow that to happen? Well, because China has deeply infiltrated the United States in every aspect.
It's I saw you raise the other day on one of the interviews the difference between our declaratory policy and virtue signaling with regards to environmental social governance, companies like Nike, slave labor, and yet also the environmental issues with China. We want to green our economy, and yet China is just not playing at all. And yet we criticize ourselves, and we cut ourselves down. And yet we're looking at what's going on there with regards to China's decisions. What are we missing here, and why is this still not being talked about? If we are going down the ESG path, should this not be front and center?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. 23 of the 25 largest polluting cities or largest CO2 emitting cities in the world are in China. 23 of 25. Now, we all publicized in all mainstream media on the front page that Xi Jinping said he's going to be carbon neutral by 2050. It's the biggest joke in the world, right? They're building more coal-fired capacity in 2021, right this minute, than exists on the entire continent of Europe. So they are representing more than 100% of the annual increase in the pollution emissions of the world every year. And how can that be? Because the US and Europe's CAFE standards and our commitment to combating climate change is actually working. We are reducing our carbon footprints between the US and Europe annually, and China is growing it like it's a weed. And so, again, we can't just, with the Chinese, you can't listen to what they say. You have to simply measure what they do. And their propaganda machine is so good at developing narratives, propagating narratives in multiple languages, and then getting academics to write white papers about those narratives because they pay everyone. I know I sound incredibly cynical, but for those that know China, it's 100% true.
Just looking at some of the tactics that are deployed by the Chinese Communist Party, we see some things, but say I were to establish a family office or a hedge fund and call myself arch super egos and lever up and then blow myself up. Is that something that we've seen? Is that something that could continue to happen in the future to the tune of billions of dollars? Are these little neutron bombs sitting within our own financial system?
So the answer is yes, but when you look at the size of the system, look, our financial system today, if you look at the assets on balance sheet in our banks, is about $21 trillion. What's $40 billion here and there, and I say that because it won't detonate our system. The one good thing about China's belligerence actually is our banking and investment banking edifices don't have off-balance sheet giant leverage positions with Chinese financial institutions because the Chinese would never submit themselves to US law. So all of our agreements require Western law, whether it's UK or US law, when you enter into these agreements with counterparties. So the good news is if you remember the linkages between the US and Europe and the US banks and European banks in 2008, no one really knew how much off-balance sheet exposure there was and how much off-balance sheet leverage there was. The good news is that kind of exposure and leverage does not exist with the Chinese banks or Chinese financial institutions. So I don't think there's a, call it, leveraged neutron bomb ready to go off in our system as a result of something that either a Chinese national or Chinese institution is doing. The Archegos situation was, yes, it was awful and it cost banks a lot of money, but it didn't really threaten our financial system.
Okay. What other major issues do you think are important for national security types to wrap their heads around? And do you see the champion becoming, US DOD and allied partner nations, militaries, trying to push for this because we're behind the eight ball on unrestricted warfare? Or do you see this having to come from state treasury Fed?
So it's very important to note fundamental differences and also the incentives between the Fed, the Treasury, DoD, and state. And I'll give you kind of real world examples. When you look at the composition of, let's say, the U.S. Treasury at any point in time, it is full of ex-Goldman, ex-Morgan Stanley, ex-Credit Suisse. It is staffed with Wall Street, and then it's got some sprinklings of academics in there that have also been, let's say, so the Wall Street is motivated, or its incentive structure is just to grow Wall Street, to grow the fee streams, to grow the M&A fees, the IPO fees, and fees. And so we all know that the Treasury has been essentially an extension of Goldman Sachs for the past couple of decades. And so when you and I, if DoD and state walks in and says, we want to sanction the Bank of China because we have the evidence that shows they are funding the Iranian National Oil Company, and they are allowing the Iranian National Oil Company to move funds around the world and continue to operate despite US hard sanctions on Iran. And the Treasury, the head of the Secretary of the Treasury, who is ex-Goldman Sachs, would say, oh no, you can't do that. That will be declaring economic war against China, and the markets will crash, and then, Mr. President, you won't get reelected. That probably happened 200 times a year in the last 4 years. So when you say, should this come out of DoD? The answer is yes. Does DoD have the financial expertise to really understand the architecture, the flows, and how that kind of war, that kind of battleground needs to be staffed? I'm not sure. So I worry that if you go, if you were to randomly pull people out of the top positions in Treasury, in state, in the National Security Council and DoD, I'm pretty sure you would find a subterfuge right away that has just different incentives, that isn't thinking purely about national security. They're thinking about their next paycheck when they come out of government. They're thinking about all of their friends that are still partners at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan. I think you need people that are untethered, that have an interest on US national security as their base case. And so, yes, I would feel much better personally if we had financially adept people inside DoD leading this charge.
That would be wonderful. Unfortunately, I'm also cynical in the concern that we're probably going to kick this down the road much longer. Do you hold that opinion as well, or how does this play out?
Michael, how many press releases and news stories do we need to see that show what's going on here? I mean, there was one just this morning about a Chinese national who had become a US citizen that had been sentenced to 2 years in prison because he was sending hydrophones to the Chinese military university against US law. He was laundering the money. He was doing it surreptitiously, and he was doing it from the US. I mean, in earlier days, that would be crimes of high treason, and you might even be executed for it. Today, it was a $20,000 fine and 2 years in jail, and he'd already served 3 months. Not a big deal. You know, I think what we've got to do is start realizing that treasonous crimes are serious, and we should deport these people once they serve a much longer sentence than 2 years. Like, I can't believe the sentencing guidelines that I'm seeing from the judges on these treason and espionage cases. So when you say, are we just going to kick this down the road? We just need to have someone collect all of the data of all of the various malicious invasions of our national security and just put them all on a whiteboard. And then we need to get people to understand that we better start fighting, as you put it, with a whole of government approach. And we need to realize we need to realize they're our enemy and stop using words like strategic competitor. Call them what they are. And people say, well, we worry if we decouple with China, it's going to cost us. I hear economists that are pro-China say it'll cost us 2.5% of GDP. And I say, well, if you read the DIUX reports and the reports from the White House, the Chinese steal about 2% of GDP from us in intellectual property every year, and they earn a return on that theft. So my view is we'd be better off if we decoupled from China. Yeah, we'd have to find somewhere else to make our cheap tennis shoes and electronics, but we could find countries that actually are responsible global actors.
And on that note, with other countries, we've primarily focused on the U.S. What I'm seeing and concerns me gravely is the periphery of what used to be the rules-based order, which is still there, but I think it's fractured. What happens to nations on the periphery, like your Canadas, like your Brazils? You mentioned the Middle East and certain countries in Europe that are on the fence about how this goes. And obviously, if their bread's being buttered on both sides, then that works for them. That puts the U.S. in an awkward position. How do you see that developing, and what's the situation there?
You know, if you notice Secretary Blinken's most recent trip, he reiterated around Southeast Asia that the U.S. won't force our allies and trading partners to choose a side between us and China. So we are already succumbing to the belief that we're going to be in a multipolar/bipolar world. But to your point about countries like Brazil that really rely on China and Australia, who's part of Five Eyes today, you know, that's going to be a very tricky diplomatic situation for us. Now, we've dealt with those tricky situations in the past, right? You think about Qatar, or you think about Bahrain, and you think about even Saudi Arabia for that matter. You know, are they our friend or our foe? Well, they're both. You know, so I think we can still maintain those kinds of arrangements with other countries. But I do think we need to have a coalition of the willing amongst the rules-based order in the West against kind of the new axis of evil, which seems to be China, Russia, Iran, and their proxies today. And it's clear that that's happening. And what we need to do is start really putting together a grand strategy ourselves on how to deal with that kind of dual axis world.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other final points that you think national security professionals need to absorb, or anything further that you think should amplify the conversation?
So if I implore the national security complex to reach out, those that have security clearances and those that have specific friends in the intelligence community in the US, reach out to the intelligence community and talk to them, find the leadership and talk to them about what true risk the digital RMB brings to the United States and the rules-based order. If you don't believe me, go to the top of our intelligence community, and I am certain you will find people that are sympathetic to what we're discussing today, and talk to them in depth about what those problems are and what those risks are, and how large the problem is. Because again, don't just listen to me, go to the IC and you'll understand what I'm talking about. Okay, thank you. Two more final points. One is, if you could recommend one book right now on this topic, or others that you consider most important right now. There's a book that has just been released. I've just begun to read it, called Roulette. I don't know if you've seen this, but it's to talk about someone that has lived in China and has and understands what kind of influence campaigns have worked against them, and how difficult and coercive that government's been, and how they threaten the family, and how they basically it's an inside look at how the CCP operates. And that's a great book. There's another great book out there by someone that I think is one of the greatest minds of our generation. It's a guy named Larry Lindsey. He used to be a Fed governor. He was he ran Bush's White House Economic Council, Bush 43, and he wrote a book called Currency Wars. It's a fictional view with real world. I call it historical fiction, right? Or maybe even hysterical fiction, because it's not based on history, but it has, sex and intrigue and this and that. But it's a really good book. anchored around the risks we're facing today and how it's likely to play out. So if you enjoy a little twist, a little fiction, but those two books are great books. But I think the bottom line is there's nothing great written about Chinese grand strategy other than unrestricted warfare. And if you get a one of those, you should absolutely read one of those if you're in the national security mindset.
Okay, thank you. And if anyone needs to get in touch with you, the best place to reach out or follow you on social media?
So, no. Anyone in the national security community, I'd be happy to help. Reach out, and I'll help to the extent that I can.
Okay, Mr. Bass, thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate the time.